throughout this presentation today, the goal is to pretty much to destroy some dogmas that are existent in the industry today. So all the time that we talk about corn silage, if you want to improve the nutritive value of that, there are two main ways of doing that. The first way is to increase the starch digestibility, and the second way is the fiber digestibility. So all the time that we evaluate corn silage, although we need to look at that as a whole, we first need to separate those portions and understand what's going on and what are we really improving and what are we not improving. So if you think about that, whole plant corn silage is divided in a yellow fraction, that's the grain fraction, that's mainly comprised by starch. And because of this yellow fraction, corn silage is going to have approximately 30% starch. In some regions of the country goes more or less than that, and depending the year, it will be more or less than that. Okay? But on the other hand, if we think about the fiber portion, represented here as the green portion, we are talking about NDF, or fiber, and that's where we're going to focus when we enter in that specific color of the presentation. So I'll first focus on starch, as this was the main area was involved, but if by any chance there are other questions related to fiber digestibility that I don't cover today, feel free to ask. So when we talk about the yellow portion, there are two main factors that inhibit starch digestibility in kernels. First, corn is a seed, so it's very hard. So it's a physical factor that we need to overcome in order to expose starch and make sure that bacteria in the rumen or enzymes in the intestine will have access to this starch, so the starch will be digested and energy be used by dairy cows. But even if we break this, the pericarp, that is this hardest portion that it's outside the kernel, there is a chemical factor that inhibits starch digestibility. And it's a protein that's often called prolamine, or more specifically, zinc protein in corn. This protein surrounds the starch and inhibits the access by rumen bacteria as well as the access by enzymes to this starch. So to break kernels, it is the most important factor to increase starch digestibility, but it's not enough. There are much more there that we need to do in order to increase digestibility. And if you look to this list of 5 factors, this is probably the order of importance in order to increase the starch digestibility. Kernel processing, or in other words, kernel breakage, it is and will always be the most important factor, because if you don't break what is outside the corn, there's nothing you can do if it is inside. After that, I'll bring the duration of silage fermentation, what's probably the most current topic discussed right now, at least based on what I have to present today. But instead of discuss what duration of silage fermentation does to start digestibility, what I will anticipate for you. The longest the silage stays in the silo, more digestible starch will be. What can we do with this specific strategy to overcome other issues related to starch digestibility, such as kernel maturity and endosperm properties? Can we use duration of silage fermentation as a tool to overcome that? I will try to answer that today. So kernel maturity. Very often we try to allow corn plants to stay in the field longer because they accumulate starch. The question is this starch as digestible as if you harvest immature corn silage? No, it's not, because the same way that the plant accumulates starch, it accumulates zinc proteins. So it's not as digestible. So probably you have, at maximum, the similar level of digestible starch, but probably less. And endosperm properties is related to hybrids. Flora hybrids, they are more digestible than vitreous hybrids, and the reason is they have less of those proteins. And the last factor is additives, and I put here as experimental because the only additive I know that you can add during harvest to corn silage that helps with starch digestibility is exogenous protease. They are not in the market, okay? Unless it's a brand new product that I'm not aware of. Okay, so it's experimental. When we discuss fiber digestibility, we have the same issue as in starch, but instead of having zinc proteins, we have lignin. Now if you work with diet formulation, lignin is being replaced with UNDF, or undigested NDF. UNDF is easier to measure in the laboratory than lignin, but for the purpose of this presentation, lignin will have exactly the same impact as UNDF. And to increase fiber digestibility, our goal should always be to reduce the ratio between lignin and NDF, because less lignin means that the fiber is more available to be digested. To do that, there are 5 different ways: selecting hybrids, and I will talk a little bit about that. The environment, as Dr. Vendramini just presented, soil and weather drastically affects grasses. Corn is not an exception, but we cannot control that, so I cannot discuss that. Maturity, the same way as in protein and starch accumulates as the plant matures, lignin also accumulates. So theoretically, it's supposed to be less digestible. Cutting height, similar to other grasses, if you cut corn plants a little bit higher, you have less lignin because the lignin stays in the bottom of the plant, so they're more digestible. I will not talk about that because most part of the time, when you increase cutting height, you need to harvest more area in order to achieve the same amount of corn silage to feed your cows, and it's not everybody that would have this amount of area. And last would be additives, and again, I will list that as experimental, but not because they are not in the market, because they are, but because they show a lot of variance in the response, either if we are talking about fibrolytic enzymes or if we are talking about specific inoculants that the bacteria produce fibrolytic enzymes. Okay? I'm not saying that they do not work. I'm just saying that they don't work all the time. So in order to use them, make sure you ask company representatives for data in your area using hybrids very similar to what you use. And now that I passed the first slide, I'll try to convince you that everything I said is true. So corn silage impacts, corn silage harvest practice impact dairy cattle production. And this is 100% true. So during my master's, I had opportunity to run a meta-analysis. In other words, I went to literature and I grabbed all the papers published in this topic, put them together in a spreadsheet, and run new sets of statistics. Okay? I'll not explain you that. That's extremely boring. The only thing I want to know from this slide is that all the trials were with lactating dairy cows fed a TMR, which the main forage constituent was corn silage, and they measure starch digestibility in vivo. Okay? So we measure dry matter content as a proxy for maturity, and I certainly understand that kernel maturity may be more important than dry matter content sometimes, but the researchers do not understand that, and few times they report properly kernel maturity. So it was really hard to put data together on that. So don't use only dry matter content as I'm doing, but it's a good indicator. So we separate in categories, and if you go to the milk production row, you see that milk production is much lower when corn silage was harvested above 40% dry matter. And there is one main reason for that. The reason is, if you go to TTSD, which stands for total tract starch digestibility, starch digestibility is lower in those type of corn silage. In other words, you had more starch in your corn silage, but it does not translate into greater milk production. In this specific case, translated into lower milk production. And it's not a small amount. It's 4 pounds per cow per day. You can do your math on that. You probably know much better than I do what does that mean for dairy profitability. The second main important factor, as I told you, is kernel processing. And we have a drastic confounding factor in this slide. And the reason is we use harvester set with a processor set for 1 to 3 millimeter of row gap settings to 4 to 8 millimeters or unprocessed. The problem is, a lot of time ago, when researchers used to do those type of research, the unprocessed treatment was using a much smaller theoretical length of cut. If you ever work with a harvester, you know that as you put knives closer, the probability you hit kernels is much higher. So it's a huge bias in this specific result. But even like that, you can see the milk production is slightly greater here, which is related to greater total tract starch digestibility. So right now, we have data showing that maturity affects starch digestibility and kernel processing affects starch digestibility. and that both affects milk production. But what I didn't tell you in the dry matter content slide that I just presented is that it's not only related to the zinc protein content that accumulated together with starch when maturity increased. When we have greater dry matter content, the dry matter content of the kernel is also greater. In other words, the kernel gets harder and harder. So it's more difficult to break. And that's exactly what this slide shows us. When we have very mature corn silage, kernel processor was not effective, but not because it didn't work, but because the unprocessed work as well. Because the kernel is not hard. So it's much easier to break with knives. As you start increasing maturity, kernel processing becomes extremely important and necessary. But as we go to above 40% dry matter, it's ineffective. Will this happen in every situation? No. You have situations where it's going to break. The problem is there are a lot of situations that will not. So the question you need to answer yourself is it worth the risk? In my opinion, it's not. But I keep talking about kernel processing, and how do we measure kernel processing? So the most common way of measuring kernel processing is the kernel processing score, often referred to as corn silage processing score. This is a method that was developed using a set of sieves, and based on the 4.75 millimeter sieve, all the starch that passed through is considered to be from kernels that were broken in at least 4 pieces. Okay? This hypothesis was standing for many years. I will tell you now, this is not true. Okay? I will not show you this data today, but we already have data on that. But it's not completely a lie. Okay? From the data set they had there, it was true. But they used 30 hybrids. We repeat that with 120 different hybrids. And probably what they had there was representative of a region rather than different places. Okay? So I'm not blaming them for that. By the way, I consider corn silage processing score a great method, and I highly advise you to measure that. And Dr. Mertens, when he developed that, he created a score. So if more than 70% of your starch passed through that sieve, it's considered excellent. Between 50 and 70 is adequate, and lower than 50% is poor. So throughout this presentation, that's the classification we are going to use. I did not create that. I'm just using the industry guidelines for that. And to show you how effective corn silage processing score is, this is data presented by the Kristen Hansen team during the International Silage Conference last year. And the light gray bars represent corn silage processing score. And the black bars represent fecal starch measuring at the farm the same day they collected the silage sample. As corn silage processing score goes down, fecal starch goes up. In other words, cows are not digesting starch, and pretty much all the starch that you pay a lot of money to plant and harvest corn is going to the manure. So processing kernels is extremely important. And today I'll try to show you another way of harvesting corn shreddage. This is probably the most common topic in terms of harvesting for corn silage in the last 4 or 5 years. And I have the opportunity to work in 2 feeding trials. Today I will present only the second one that was conducted at University of Wisconsin in those pens. We do not use cows as experimental units. We use pens. So we have pens that can feed 8 cows each. So we feed the pen rather than the cows. So we compared 3 treatments. A BMR corn silage harvested shreddage, exactly the same hybrid from the same field harvested with a conventional processor. And the third treatment was this second silage, but we added hay because the manufacturers of shreddage claim that shreddage not only break more kernels, but also bring more physically effective NDF. So we decided to use hay to compare if that's true. So as I said, we used the University of Wisconsin pens, 15 pens of 8 cows each, 5 pens per treatment. All pens were fed 2 weeks of the same diet, followed by 14 weeks of their treatment periods. In other words, we didn't switch back diets. The cows that start being fed one specific treatment stayed 14 weeks eating that diet so we could see if we have any time interaction. A quickly description of shredlage. Comparing with KP, when you analyze using the Penn State shaker box, you see that coarse particles are greater in shredlage, and that's because theoretical length of cut is suggested to be higher by shredlage manufacturers, and that's what we try to do in this trial. However, at the same time, kernel processing was slightly higher, but not only was higher, but the variance was much smaller compared with conventional process. So we end up with a silage that had greater particle size and greater kernel breakage. Can this translate into greater milk production and greater physically effective NDF? The answer is yes. If you look to the green bar, that's the shredlage treatment, you see that 6 out of 14 weeks, they are represented as an asterisk. They are greater than the blue line, that's the conventional corn silage. I will not make comments about the KPH because the hay was of bad quality. So unfortunately, we saw a drop in milk production. And so it's unfair to say that shredlage was better than a physically effective NDF hay. Okay, so I will not make comments about that other than shredlage had greater milk production than conventionally processed silage. Summary and conclusions for this specific trial. Coarsest particles both in the shredlage and shredlage TMR, but no difference in sorting behavior. Normally when we feed longer particles, we are worried about behaviors. We did not, sorting behavior. We did not see that in this trial. Greater milk production, greater processing, greater ruminal and total tract starch digestibility. We did not see any improvement on physically effective in NDF when considering milk fat or rumination activity. We measure rumination activity using SCR colors. So, one question that I receive very often in the field is, can we have properly processed corn silage without using a shredlage processor? Yes, you can. You don't need to have a shredlage processor to have properly processed corn silage. But would be easier with shredlage. But independently of being easier or not, using shredlage or conventional processing, it requires that you monitor the harvesting season. You need to be there. You need to look what's going on. Because if you leave a custom harvester or your crew harvesting there, and by any chance they don't look at that, good luck next year. Because there's nothing you can do after that. Maybe you could try to throw that in a TMR wagon and keep breaking kernels. Good luck with that as well, because you will also reduce particle size. So this is a methodology that Dr. Schieners and Dr. Brian Holmes from Biological Sister Engineering in Wisconsin put together. This is adapted from a laboratory proceeding. And it's very simple. You can do that over and over. Put your kids to do that over and over. They'll have some fun with water. I had that list during my PhD, so I'm sure they would. One thing that I don't have a picture that I highly recommend is bring a black garbage bag, put in the floor, grab a nice sample right after you harvest it, throw it there, leave 15 minutes in the sun. It's going to dry a little bit and make the whole process easier. Then you bring a bucket with water, throw the sample there, gently agitate for 1 or 2 minutes, and then you remove the top portion of that. And I'm saying that because kernels are denser than fiber. So the water is going to separate that for you. So after you remove the fiber and you remove the water, you have only kernels. To look only to kernels is much, much easier to evaluate if kernels were broken than if you look to the whole plant corn silage. Recommendations is to have no intact kernels. Put that in a dessert plate, and have no intact kernels. That should be your goal. Because if you start changing your goal to 1, 2, 3 kernels, by the end of the day will be 5, 6, maybe all. So be careful with that. Changing topics, we run a very similar feeding trial comparing hybrid types. And I will use this trial to show 2 things. First, hybrids must be selected for NDF digestibility. Second, it's feasible to select for starch digestibility. So it's exactly the same scenario as the shredlage trial. The only difference is that we use 12 pens instead of 15. and we only had 2 treatments. A BM3 hybrid that's very high in fiber digestibility, and a flory-leafy hybrid that's very high in starch digestibility. Theoretically, we were supposed to have an intermediate treatment, but that was in 2012 when the Midwest had that huge drought year, so we had issues with that. And unfortunately, we only end up with 2 hybrids. But this confirms that, first, BMR had much lower starch digestibility than flory-leafy, but much higher NDF digestibility. And this is related to lower lignin and lower undigested NDF. Okay? Diets were exactly the same, so the hybrids create a response, and the response is, when you have a forage with higher fiber digestibility, cows will eat more. More they eat, more energy they have available. I think this translates in great milk production. But there is no feed efficiency here. So they eat more, produce more. And they also produce more protein and more lactose. Okay? That's what you should take as a take-home message for NDF digestibility. If you go to the literature and you summarize then, actually we did that, I'm just not presenting, most part of the trials show this response. It's very, very constant. But I'm talking about BM3. I'm not talking about BM1 or other hybrids that claim to increase fiber digestibility. But the hybrid that we expected to have greater starch digestibility had much greater starch digestibility. So there is potential. So in the future, we need to repeat this trial, but comparing this hybrid with conventional hybrids, because to be honest with you, it was an unfair comparison. And unfortunately for that company, they sponsored the trial. Okay, so I just mentioned this conclusion. So changing to corn silage fermentation, it does increase starch digestibility. So what we want to evaluate is, can we use the storage length to overcome maturity and hybrid effects on starch digestibility? And we run 2 trials to answer this question. The first one compared for BMR and for leafy, because we assumed that BMR had lower starch digestibility, which is another very common response that we see in the field. And the reason why we are saying that starch digestibility is greater over time is because if you compare the green lines that are starch digestibility, they increase from 0 up to 240 days of ensiling, but there's something else that increases: ammonia, nitrogen, and soluble crude protein. And the reason is the zinc protein I mentioned over and over that's detrimental to starch digestibility, those specific zinc proteins, they are insoluble. And the bacteria in the silo can break them down and transform them to soluble protein. So as you can see, that's what's happening when you leave silage for longer periods in the silo. But didn't ask the question that I asked before. So can we use that to overcome difference in hybrids? And my first experiment was really frustrating because we didn't see a difference in the beginning. But by another hand, it opened our eyes to a potential different issue. We don't have statistics to prove that for this trial, but the difference between hybrids increased. And that put us in shock because it was supposed to be the opposite: start bigger and decrease the difference between them. That's what our hypothesis was. So we had to repeat the experiment. But in that specific trial, we also measure if NDF digestibility changes over time. So if you expect to keep silage in the silo for longer periods to increase fiber digestibility, I apologize, it's not going to happen. Okay, it's not a good strategy for that. So we decided to run a second experiment to see if what we saw was an accident or if maybe true. And we decide, I didn't decide, Dr. Shaver decided that I had to run a bigger experiment. So we used 3 hybrids, coincidentally the 3 hybrids that we used in the feeding trial I just presented. So we were 100% sure that BMR was lower in digestibility than dual purpose, that was lower in digestibility than the leaf flory. We used 2 maturities, 2 particle size, no effects on particle size, so I'm not going to present. Protease, but it's not in the market, so I'm not going to present. And 5 time points of ensiling. So the goal here is to see, does ensiling time overcome issues of maturity or hybrids on starch digestibility? So here's your first answer: no, it does not. Okay? Fermentation does not solve for everything, as is very common to hear in the industry. Someone threw this comment out there some time ago, that I don't know how long time ago, but this is a problem because it's not true. The hybrid that started more digested was always more digested and actually increased the difference. The hybrid that was less digestible was always less digestible. So hybrid type matters a lot when selecting for starch digestibility. By the way, a quick question. Those hybrids are not necessarily in this order. Who thinks that the white one is the more digestible? Good, nobody. Who thinks it's the yellow one? Yeah, we had some people. That's very common. Everybody answers that. Yellow looks nice. What color is pure starch? Exactly. So this is the more digestible hybrid. Starch is available, ready to go. That's what we should be looking for. Okay, I know that yellow looks much better. Okay, particularly I prefer red, as I'm from Wisconsin, right? But we don't have red corn, as far as I know. With maturity, it's exactly the same issue. Early harvest was always more digestible. We didn't overcome that. But you don't say that we learned something in this trial is if you have to harvest different seasons and one end up in a much later maturity, maybe you should start feeding that later. So this way they at least get similar digestibility to the silo that was prepared first. Okay? So keep that in mind. Same thing for hybrids. If you have more than one hybrid, you may start feeding the more digestible hybrid first. So a quick summary. Break more kernels. If you don't break kernels, everything else I said doesn't matter because you're not going to achieve it. So make sure you properly measure kernel breakage at harvest. Because if you don't break it there, your next chance is next year. And that's a lot of time. It may be a lot of money. Allow silage to ferment for an extended period. Ideally, it's good to have inventory for at least extra 4 months because the initial 4 months are the most important in terms of increasing starch digestibility. The graphs are unfair because they are not properly aligned related to days. So you cannot really see that it's a curve rather than a line. I should change those graphs, by the way. But maybe an opportunity to increase the starch digestibility. And to be honest with you, farmers knew that this happened for much longer than when we did in research. Because I'm sure you all realize that when you open a new silo, milk production goes down. When you reach the spring, milk fat goes down. And this is related probably to starch digestibility. So something that you have been telling us for a lot of time was never tested. Finally, we decided to test, and we saw a lot of issues, probably more than we expected. Harvest at the correct maturity. Maturity brings more starch, but also brings worse fermentation. I didn't show this data today. Also brings more zinc protein, so it's less digestible. Also brings more lignin, so it's less digestible in terms of fiber. So it's risky to try to get more starch at the expense of those other things. And when available, use hybrids with more flora endosperms. One thing that you should keep in mind, independently of the hybrid that you use, go to hybrid performance trials because hybrids perform different in different regions because of weather and soil conditions. We cannot prove that because it's really hard to measure those things, and I'm not a specialist on this topic, by the way, so it's really hard to show that. But hybrid performance trials with hybrids that are in those trials over and over can give you an idea how the variation is. Variation from year to year is sometimes more important than a specific value. And additives, at this point, I don't think they're feasible, so not even discuss. So don't say that I didn't present anything new. This is the first time I'm presenting a new procedure that we are discussing with commercial labs in order to improve corn silage processing score measurements. We combined that hydrodynamic separation that I presented to be using in the field with the corn silage processing score. So as you can see, the kernels really go to the bottom. Okay, I was not lying. I didn't separate by hand and throw water there. It was true, so here you can see. Then we dry this material, pass through all those sieves, and similar to what we do with dry corn or high moisture corn, we measure particle size, mean particle size. And the reason why we are suggesting that is because from particle size we can try to predict starch digestibility using a spreadsheet. This specific spreadsheet was developed for corn grain and high moisture corn. It may be used for corn silage, but we still will be improving that. But the reason why I'm saying that mean particle size is more important is because let's just suppose that everything that passed the 4.75 millimeter sieve is really broken in 4 pieces, okay? In at least 4 pieces. Maybe broken in 5, 6, 10, 15, 20, 64, maybe 200 different pieces. Are they all digested the same? No, they are not. And that's what this graph does. We had a group of interns that I had the pleasure to coordinate for this trial. They spent a decent amount of time cutting kernels by hand using a blade. And they cut kernels in 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and 64 pieces. They wanted to go to 132. We decided that was not worth their time and the danger to cut their fingers. So, but they wanted to, so they deserve much more credit than I do for this trial. And after that, we incubate for in situ measurements to see, are they all digested as fast or the same way? No, they are not. This is the 4. So if you consider everything 4, but how about if they are all 64s? Your digestibility rate is much higher. And if you consider that's not that high, you may end up with acidosis, if you don't, depending on how you formulate your diets. So what we do is we measure geometric mean particle size, and we throw in that specific spreadsheet, and we predict starch fermentation rate, ruminal starch digestibility, and ruminal total tract digestibility. Obviously, that would be some sort of linear, some linear effect, because the more you break kernels, more they are digested, lower the probability that they will end up in the manure. Said that, this is my new email here at University of Florida. If you have any questions related to this presentation or any other topics related to dairy nutrition, feel free to send me an email. If you have suggestions of things that we should be testing that will help the dairy industry to grow here in Florida, do not hesitate contacting me. More important than that, if you want to sponsor trials, don't send me an email. Go to my office and we can arrange that faster. Okay? Said that, thank you for your attention. I'll be glad to entertain questions.
Right, do we have questions?
Yes.